Hey folks, welcome back. So in a few videos recently, I've called liberals some version of feckless or toothless, and I felt the need to clarify what I meant for a second. Because it's not that the vague ideas they have minor vocal support for are awful in every sense of the word. It's more so that their idea for activism seems to be kneeling in a courtroom, and their idea of appealing to different voters seems to be playing Despacito on a phone or telling people to Pokemon Go to the polls. So as we approach the midterms, not that any Democrat is going to watch this, but I just wanted to take a moment to really go over the different platforms between each party and really see if there's really any affirmative reason to vote blue. Because that's an honest question I want to ask here. Why, at this point, should anybody even vote blue? And that's not to say that voting red is suddenly a good thing. It is to criticize the fact that there's a whole lot of nothing over here. So let's start with a topic that it breaks my heart to be such a big deal, and that is the fact that Republicans are aggressively anti-trans and gay. Republicans are so aggressively anti-trans, particularly anti-trans kids, because of course, if you want to stop trans people from existing, you make it harder for kids to hear about the concept of transness, understand that it might be a thing that would soothe their existential woes, and you of course push the ability to transition late into their adulthood to the point it becomes super difficult to go through a second puberty and is emotionally a toil. So of course you cut all that off, you limit the number of trans people without having to just murder them. But on the flip side, can it be said that Democrats are in any way meaningfully pro-trans? That's a genuine question. Have they pushed any transgender protection bills? As I'm looking on my phone, by the way, there are some lovely polls about the fact that this position is extremely unpopular even among Republicans. But of course, what doesn't matter is being popular. What matters is turning out your base in the midterms. And this type of thing is exactly how you get shitty evangelicals out to vote en masse. But as it turns out, on a federal level, I can't find any meaningfully pro-trans legislation, and of course they would then go on to say, oh, the Senate gets in the way, we want to pass all these bills. But there's plenty that can be done, there's plenty of executive actions and ways that you can try to make change happen even if you don't have the Senate, So I think it is safe to say the Democrats are not anti-trans. And that's about as far as it goes. Hey folks, Editing Piley here. Wanted to clarify that during the recording of this segment, I forgot about the Equality Act, which would be a helpful step forward, enshrining gender identity and sexual orientation in the list of civil rights protections we already have on the books. So you could argue this is a fairly affirmative reason to vote for at least Democratic Senate candidates, seeing as that's the last barrier for this bill to cross. But to be picky about civil rights for a second, and I know, I'm being really selfish with this one, I don't think the Equality Act on its own would do enough to stop the disgusting wave of anti-trans and anti-queer legislation in the country. So rather than being the end-all be-all, the Equality Act is one of several necessary steps, and I wish that the other steps were on the table. I think that could be a very affirmative reason to go vote for people, but it's not. So nevertheless, it doesn't feel like a super affirmative reason to go vote for these people. Anyways, back to the video. I also just realized this sentence could be read as aggressively anti-trans and the parentheses implying and aggressively gay, which, that sums up a lot of TERFs out there. Let's move on to healthcare. Republicans are firmly pro-market-driven care. So now we have to ask, what are Democrats doing on healthcare? Well, Joe Biden did just sign an executive order that brings more people under ACA coverage, And they did just pass a bill through the House to lower co-pays for insulin, not for all prescription drugs, not as it was like 1996, all medicine made with the benefit of public funding. It is just specifically insulin co-pays are capped a little bit. So that brings up a good question. What could we meaningfully say Democrats are in favor of when it comes to healthcare? See, because of course I read a lot of their decisions here as bending over backwards to preserve a employer-based private healthcare system. But of course they are taking tiny little steps away from that. So I'm sure plenty of people would say that it's actually stepping toward horrific communism of the healthcare marketplace. Let's say Democrats are pro-market care with a heart. They're all for companies charging 1,200% more for insulin in the year 2020 than 1996. But they just want the copay to be a little less. So the people producing the insulin can still get 1,200% more than they did 25 years ago. It's just that insurance will cover a little bit more of it this time. God forbid we make it so that insulin just not be 1,200% more. Because what about the people who don't have insurance? You know, what are they supposed to do? So I think it's fair to say they're pro-market care and just trying to make it a little bit nicer around the edges. Whereas you have people like Matt Gaetz out there saying that people who need insulin a lot should just eat healthier. You know, that represents part of the pitch on this side of the aisle. Oh, green energy, that's a topic. I'll say that they're agitating against green energy. Because there are some cases, like the fact that Texas has a decent amount of green energy in their electricity grid, but there is a lot of agitation against, like, oh no, this pipeline that's going through native land, there would be some jobs there. Like there's a lot of agitation against green energy through this really faux populist lens, and this idea that like, we're trying to preserve these hardworking jobs. Which of course, if the owners of those jobs could ship them overseas, you know they would in a heartbeat. And this is one where I don't necessarily think it's fair to say they are not for green energy. They are just for a little bit, but not too much. Because even though in like Biden's infrastructure bill, there's some money for like electric car infrastructure, some subsidies for electric car manufacturing, there's government money being put into alternatives for lithium batteries, that sort of thing. You can tell in the negotiation process that a lot of this stuff is what gets left on the cutting room floor. And it should be noted, the green energy that they are in favor of is a very individualized and liberalized version of it, where it's not so much about infrastructure like public transportation that's green. A lot of it is just make sure everyone has a Tesla instead of a Ford, or a Ford electric vehicle instead of a Ford gas guzzling vehicle. Next, speaking of the segment that I did just before this, unions and organized labor. Republicans are either against unions or for unions only if they're anti-woke. There's a video I made about a year ago now about Marco Rubio discussing the Amazon facility in Bessemer, Alabama that was trying to unionize. And he had this really weird statement where he's like, I'm for the union organizing because Amazon is getting it's becoming a socialist wing of the radical Castro Maoist woke left. Which is just such a weird position to like try to thread this needle of feigning interest in the working class having a say in anything, but you can't really commit to that too hard because you'd scare your donors. So you have to make it about how actually unions are a means of enforcing conservative values on the country. And of course, when they find themselves in the right amount of power, they'll push for, like right to work legislation and shit like that. This is actually one where Biden has done better than I would have thought on this. Democrats have shown a decent pro-union stance during the Biden presidency. but not so much that they'll do much about it. Because this gets into sort of my overall issue with Democrats at a federal level, is the idea that they'll voice vague support for like, oh, well, let's lower the cost of insulin, or oh, let's have the PRO Act so people can unionize a little easier. But there's no effort, there's no political willpower put behind pushing for those. It's just kind of like, and it is important that, Biden will draw attention to like, oh, Amazon unionized.
Amazon, here we come.
Watch. And that vocal support for unionization is a welcomed return to form, but it is not followed by any meaningful, legislative push. So I can't really give them too much credit for tweeting out unions are all right, but not doing anything to ensure that unions can exist. Now to get to a topic that Josh brought up a few minutes ago. Policing, or just, cops in general. Republicans are firmly for making sure cops stay the third largest military, and I may have misspelled military there. That's okay, because if you didn't know, the largest military in terms of dollars is the United States. The second largest military is China by a wide margin, by the way. It's like 780 billion for us, 250 billion for them. And then the third largest military is domestic US cops. So Republicans are all for even further funding for military, more riot gear, more tanks, more no-knock raids, that sort of thing. And I guess this part of the conversation is where we get into one of the more, I think, unique divisions between the party, where with a lot of these, the difference between being an AOC or a Biden on being pro-trans is whether or not you just tweet out support or try to do something in a legislative sense. But when it comes to cops, there is a clear push from leadership to fund the police. Whereas on the other side of the aisle, you have the opposite, where there's pushes, in Denver, I think it's Denver, or maybe it was Boulder City, a really successful push to have specialized healthcare workers respond to certain types of calls, a program that is so successful, by the way, they're expanding it tenfold. But there is a unique difference between trying to be actively pro-funding the police and trying to redistribute the tax dollars such that we can service human need instead of just jailing everybody all the time. So here we go. Therefore, fund the police, but with a heart. I think that sums up kind of the Joe Biden side of the party. Is, informed to the crime bill he wrote in '94, which, did a lot to expand federal prisons. There's just little things about let's put $30 million of fraction of the money spent on increasing the federal prison budget. Let's spend $25-30 million for some after school sports programs, That's sort of the moderate Democrat way of funding the police with a smile, Oh, let's talk about CRT. Republicans are firmly for a one-sided nationalist history. But this is a really funny example of where there really isn't a similar countervailing force over here. There's not pro-CRT legislation because it's not it doesn't stem from a top-down legislative effort. The blue states in my area, there's no you must teach CRT in the schools because it's not top down like it is for Republicans. There's not this weird push to force engendering a very nationalistic history. So I don't even know what to put here. Ambivalent to how history is taught? What are some other topics, folks? I'm trying to think. Oh God, there we go, that's one. Aggressively, yeah, that's how you spell aggressively, anti-abortion. So aggressive, in fact, they're trying to limit your ability to get an abortion before you would even know you're pregnant in some cases. And once again, as is quickly becoming the trend, it's almost like I had an overall point to making this segment. They are pro-choice in theory, I mean, really all that needs to be said about Democrats and their stance on doing anything about abortion. Obama had 60 senators and the House. He could have passed abortion legislation if they gave a shit. They didn't. And as soon as you have Nancy Pelosi like signaling support for these bills when some of the aggressively anti-abortion stuff came out, and of course she'll virtue signal with the bill, which sounds like a weird thing to say, but that's just the fucking Senate, folks. You can't, bills pushing for meaningfully good things have to be virtue signaling, because you will never convince 10 Republicans to vote for that. Okay, I've got room for about one more topic on my Photoshop document, and I refuse to do anything to make this much longer. So let's end on one good topic. Oh, fucking voting rights. Republicans are for making voting a gosh darn lot harder. They would, of course, say that when you make it harder, it makes it more honest. You know, you avoid corruption more. But in practice, it means by putting barriers in the way of voting, some people will either get to the voting booth and then just kind of give up, or the just general disassociation with the act of being involved in their civic duty to vote. Hey folks, Editing Piley again. Want to take a minute to clarify that their claims of rampant fraud if voting were made easier are fraudulent. Like the states that have enacted things like mail-in voting for decades don't have rampant fraud issues because this isn't an actual concern. It's of course just meant to obfuscate from the fact that making voting harder generally disaffects a cross-section of communities that don't tend to be super big fans of Republicans. So the less of those people that are able to easily access voting, the better it is for Republicans. And this is one where at a state level, Democrats are better. You know, they're passing legislation to make voting easier, to make access to voting easier. But at a federal level, and again, falling in line with everything I've said so far, they want voting to, by magic, be accessible. They want somebody else to do something about the fact that you should be able to vote without having to go through all these hoops. They don't want to be the ones to do that. They don't want to be the ones to try to force the issue in any sort of meaningful way, to play hardball or anything like that. They just want it to magically happen. So yeah, in summary, as we take a look at these well-written, well-defined, robust lists, in my humble opinion, a lot of this stuff is really not good. That is not to say they don't. Legislation that makes it so that teachers can't talk about the act of being gay and you actively make there be less gay people, not great. Agitating against green energy in a place where the IPCC just released a report the other day that we are at like the final, we have the final few years to do something about it. So it's not good to agitate against that. So I am not making this video to say that there's any, like, I don't want to fall into the Jimmy Dore or like Breaking Point's trap of talking about Democrats bad so much to the point that my audience thinks Democrats are more elitist or less favorable than Republicans. I want to make very clear, this agenda is one that scares me, you know, specifically a lot of the anti-trans bills scares me. But on the flip side, when we sit and talk about like what sort of things are meant to drive me out to the polls, like I live in a new state now, I need to register to vote if I want to vote for anybody. What on this ballot is meant to make me go out and vote for local Democrats in my area? Like what here is supposed to spark me, to motivate me to go out and vote for Democrats? And I can't really find anything other than just not being this. And that can be motivating. Like, I don't want green energy to be meaningfully obliterated in the last few years we have to do anything. So that can be motivating, but as somebody who just kind of has generally stopped caring because of how fundamentally things haven't changed the last year and some change, it's hard to look at this platform here and feel any encouragement or feel any excitement to go, vote for people. And though I don't think even if they were a little bit better about these things, that would be the end all be all. Like, again, as I said in the last segment I recorded before recording this segment, unions aren't the end all be all. I wish we were pushing for worker co-ops or like bigger public sector unions and public ownership of things. So they don't even have to match my ideal to get me out to vote. I just want them to be actively pushing, using their power for things. Because that's the big issue is, when Republicans are in power, when Trump was in power, he would use a variety of methods to try to get things done. Either he would, try to divert funding from different departments in a way that was legally a little sketchy to fund his wall before it was passed by Congress, or he would play hardball with the House of Representatives to try to get a deal to fund his border wall. But there seems to be a weird lack of a desire to do the same thing on the other side. There is instead either a fetishization of bipartisanship. Well, oh no, we don't need to push for your voting bill. I, Joe Manchin, can get Republicans on the table for my highly compromised voting bill, and then 0 Republicans vote on his highly compromised voting bill. Or when you press a Democrat and say, hey, do better, they'll just say, well, you should vote for more of us so we can have the margins we need, which again is not a very motivating statement. So in summary, to answer the question, why vote blue, I think I would give an incomplete. They have not given me a reason to elect them, just point blank. And this isn't just like virtue signaling. I actively mean it when I say, who knows if I'll register to vote and actually vote in these upcoming midterms. I easily could not because of how lackluster this platform is. So if they want people like me to show up to vote, they need to start not just virtue signaling for some of these things. They need to start putting their energy behind having an actively good platform, trying to make people's lives actively better. And it doesn't even have to be mine. Again, if they were aggressively pro-trans, that would be a huge step toward getting my vote because, I have solidarity with homies that aren't me. I want my trans homies to have as good a life as is possible with, the kinds of reactionary backlash they get. I would consider going out to vote even just to support, pro-trans bills, but they can't even really give me anything. So I've kind of talked myself in circles here at the end. That'll be it for the video today, folks. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to let me know down below if there's any other topics that you feel Democrats aren't doing really good at, if there's anything you think I missed that they're doing a good job about. Let me know at a state level how folks are doing, because that is really up in the air state to state as to what the parties are pushing for in a good way or in a bad way. But with that, let's turn it on over to the pre-recorded outro. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to toss me a like and subscribe down below. But if you really want to help me out, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, like early versions of every video, and exclusive Patreon-only videos. Plus, if you join the Piley Benton's Biggest Boys tier, you get your name read off at the end of every video. Zoth, Revo Pregame, Emily, Kyle Foley, Jennifer Jones, Caffeine Unicorn, Goblin of the Year, and Cameron Fordo. So if you want to hear your lovely name read off at the end of every video, be sure to join me on this specific tier. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.